remember the stairhead fight between Nicola Sturgeon and Joanne Lamont on STV? Because of the noise, a lot of folk missed what Joanne said, and I think it should be told day in and day out throughout the whole of Scotland. This is what she said. We're not genetically programmed in Scotland to make political decisions. Now, we've been told all of my life that we're too small, too poor, and Joanne believes we're too stupid to run ourselves. But she's not alone. There's the Herald today. Osborne warns an independent Scotland would run out of cash. Well, first of all the countries that have separated from London, from Ireland through India, through the Africans, we are the best placed to leave them. We have a well-educated people, we have institutions that are our own, we have our own educational system, and this is where I don't agree with Alex Salmon. Sorry to upset the SNP folk in the audience. We can have our own currency.
Well, welcome to this IndyNews Special Midweek show. I'm delighted to have with me my friend Jim Sillars. We're hoping that Professor Alf Baird will join us, but as he's coming from Orkney, it takes a wee bit longer. But good to see you, Jim. How are you?
I seem to be okay at my age. Yep.
Yeah. You're no young spring chicken. I was amazed back in 2014 how you got on and off that Margomobile. It was a lesson to us octogenarians. This is how it's done. But good to see you. I wanted to talk to you, Jim, in particular about the complaint you lodged with the police about the missing ferry contract details. Have you heard anything back?
No, not yet. I mean, the question now is the email that was suddenly produced. Is that the only missing documentation?
No.
According to the debate, there are more documents which are still to be found. And I had a look at it. The politicians in the Scottish Parliament were scoring political points galore, but nothing actually was done to pin them down. So I had a look at the legislation, and the Public Finance and Accountability Act is a Scottish Parliament Act, and within it, people are called accountable officers. In every public authority in Scotland where public funds are involved, there is an accountable officer for the money that is in fact spent. So it seemed to me that was highly relevant. Somewhere in that whole machine, the accountable officer or accountable officers must have had a look at that contract and also at the caveats in the contract that it was a somewhat different contract from the normal. And then there's the Freedom of Information Act. It requires people to record things so that the public under freedom of information can get information. And in fact, it's a crime within that act to destroy documentation. Then the other act I looked up is the Public Records Act, where the keeper of the records requires, and it's in statute, that Scottish ministers and other public authorities actually have a record plan so that nothing actually gets lost and everything that should go goes into the archives. Now, it struck me that this was not usual. I mean, it was inconceivable that documents would go missing on a contract as politically important as well as commercially important. And I looked up, it's an old common law crime called misconduct in public office. that applies north and south of the border. And it's been used several times in the last 3 or 4 years south of the border. So I wrote to the Chief Constable saying that prima facie, there's a case for misconduct in public offices on the part of persons. I didn't point my finger at anyone because it looks, we go through the Acts of Parliament, there's a fair number of people have responsibility. So if the missing email is the only missing document, I would expect the police to tell me everything's okay. But if it is not, then I would expect them to continue the investigation on the basis of misconduct in public office.
Well, I mean, I attended last week a launch at the Strathclyde University Innovation Centre of alternatives to what we've done in Scotland in terms of ordering these ferries. But certainly the view from the people I spoke to there was it was completely inconceivable that a contract of that size would not have a complete audit trail. And, it's not just a fault of the politicians. The civil service themselves have a very clear responsibility to record everything. Who was at the meeting, who said what decisions were taken, was there contract signed? So, to me, it's a real mystery. And of course, the problem the government have is that these ferries in general are a complete and utter mess. I mean, this week has just been disastrous. They've lost a 33-year-old ferry with engine trouble. Who would have thought that would happen? And then another one managed to hit the pier, and it's currently on its way to Greenock to go into dry dock. So it's withdrawn from service. To cover that up, they've taken a ship off the Arran route, probably the busiest internal ferry route we've got, and crucial at this time of the year where tourism's beginning to pick up. All these poor businesses have been sacrificed with COVID for the last couple of years. Here's the first chance of some form of recovery, and the whole system's let them down.
Well, there are two aspects to the ferry fiasco. One is commercial. How did you get yourself into this particular commercial mess? Secondly, there's a political aspect, and that's why knowing who made the decisions are extremely important. And the reason I say it's political, Nicola Sturgeon went and for the launch of the Glen Sannox. Now, if I had gone along to do the launch and I had seen that there were no windows, that the windows actually had been painted in and that there was a false funnel, I wouldn't have cancelled the launch, because that would have been a real political problem for everybody in the yard. But afterwards, I would have called everybody in to find out what the hell has been going on. I mean, why are we launching a vessel with painted in windows? The reason is that was necessary political, because Nicola wanted to go and make a declaration later on at the party conference, about what we've done. The need now for a full investigation is there. But of course, the person who would grant a judicial inquiry is in fact Nicola Sturgeon herself. So I don't think that's likely to happen. That's why I went to the police, because basically it was Jack McConnell sort of said the police should be brought in. But Jack actually didn't do anything to bring the police in. So that's why I did it. I mean, somebody along the line has to put their finger on a button that really matters.
Yeah, I agree totally, Jim. I'm bemused at this. My business never ever dealt in millions, but I know that when I was making substantial arrangements for a contract, there was documentation. It was recorded. All the parties involved had copies of it. And this is where the lost contracts is just not possible, in my view. I mean, Ferguson's must have copies. The civil service must have copies. The politicians should have copies. And I mean, I thought that one email that was discovered, which probably would never have been discovered if it hadn't been for your letter to the police. I think you can claim the entire credit for that. You know, it was severely redacted, and, you know, I've got to say, I found that amazing. I mean, all the practice they had in redacting documents throughout the whole Salmond incidents, you know, and they still couldn't do it properly. I mean, Douglas Ross, of all people, not the sharpest tool in the box, he was able to use cut and paste, and it revealed that John Swinney was up to his neck in it, you know. So it's political cover-up. I mean, you had Keith Brown running into a canteen to avoid reporters. I mean, it's absolutely making a mockery of the Scottish Parliament, and it needs addressed.
Well, one of the things that I've picked up, you know, anecdotally, is that there are now people measuring the worth of independence on the basis of the performance of the Scottish government. Now, it's not 20% or anything like that, but there's a whole number of people have said to me, if independence means it's going to be run by that government in Holyrood, I'm no going to vote for it. And there's going to come a time when more and more people are going to start saying independence means continuation of SNP government, because the party that first wins independence is going to win the first general election thereafter. They're able to say to opponents, you never wanted this, you know, the public shouldn't trust you with something you never wanted. So the advantage is to the party that gets independence. And folk are saying, this government's incompetent. And do we have to go into an incompetent Scottish independence? So they're damaging the independence movement at the same time as they're damaging our economic basis in our society. And I'll give you an example, a current example. Now, I'm in favour of the public ownership of the railways. But before you take a private sector into public ownership, you should actually do your research and think about the possible consequences. For example, the railways have always been an industry. The trade unions have been used to bargaining on industrial terms. The moment you take the railway into public ownership, then the railway workers are subject to public policy decisions. Suddenly, the railwomen are exactly in the same position as the teachers and the nurses and the local authority workers. Now, this is happening after years and years of being engaged in an industrial endeavour. And the three most effective trade unions in Britain at the present time are the RMT, ASLEF, and the TSSA, who are all railway, who are not going to accept public sector policy on the basis say, we're not the same. We've always had it industrially, and to offer them 2% means a 7% cut in the living standard when inflation's at 9%. You know, they hadn't thought things through. Take it into public ownership, but create a separate corporation that keeps it in the industrial sphere and away from the rest of the public sector. Haven't they done that? Now they're facing real problems of the unions, which should have been thought through. I mean, it doesn't matter where you look. And, you know, this morning, Brian Wilson in The Scotsman is having a go at the SNP government on the basis of education. And he's pointing out that even in the sort of better areas where people have enough money to live on, the literacy rate in primary is just over 80%. But in the areas of deprivation, it's just over 50%. I mean, these are catastrophic piece of data if you're talking about how Scotland's in the future over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years is going to earn its living in a highly competitive world where Asia is on the rise to a very considerable extent, and the middle class in Africa are now beginning to assert themselves, and Africa will become less of a basket case and more of a very active part in the international economy. Now, we've got to earn our living in that world. And if we have an education system where a fair number of our young people are illiterate, if 50% of them are illiterate, we'll not be standing still as an economy. We'll be going backwards. And we're in a very difficult position at the moment with a government that, no matter where you look, is actually incompetent.
Yeah, but that's a recent development, Jim, because I remember 2007 onwards, I know a lot of people that were against the SNP, but I could always weaken them by saying it's one of the most competent governments we've ever had. And they would say, yeah, I'm still not voting SNP, but I agree it's a very competent government. And that makes the pain of what's happening these days all the worse, because it's in sharp contrast to what has been delivered by the first SNP administration. They changed things for the better, and it was recognised by the Scottish public. They were making changes, and they were good changes. Now people look, and they look at issues like GRA, hate crime bill, this, that, and that. They say, what are these people's priorities? There's so much going wrong elsewhere. You've just pointed out one example in education. There are countless more, and they're doing nothing about it. And they're hiding from it. They'll all be in the canteen at this rate. They'll all be in the canteen because none of them will be willing to go out and meet what the public are saying.
I think the reason that they're getting away with it is on the basis that they are the major engine that would take us forward to independence. So basically what people say, yes, but wheesht for Indy, wheesht for Indy. Don't be too critical because it's independence that matters most. What those who are saying wheesht for Indy aren't prepared to face up to is that in the meantime, we are ruining the lives of children and families.
Absolutely.
And the economic basis of our society. And a price is going to be paid for that. If we finally become independent, by then, there'll be huge problems that we will have to tackle in the first case rather than reconstructing the Scottish economy. I mean, this is a tragic period we're going through at the present time, all because of wheesht for Indy. Now, I'm for independence, but I'm for good schools. I'm for ferries that work. I'm for trains that run. I see no contradiction in me saying, government, you're wrong. You've got to improve. And at the same time saying I'm for independence. Because I don't think it's SNP alone that will take us to independence. We need a much broader organisation than simply to be led by the SNP.
Well, that's a useful bridge you've created there, Jim, because I was wanting to move on to just how believable do you think it is that we'll see an Indy ref in 2023? And if we were to, how prepared, or should I say unprepared, are we for such a contest?
Well, it's the cart before the horse. I don't want a referendum unless we can win it. That's why I argue for 60% sustained support for independence in the opinion polls. Now, the reason for that figure is that when you come to the debate and the decision, it doesn't matter which election or referendum you're in, but the status quo, people tend to go back to the status quo by a few percentage points. So if we want 55% victory, we've got to start at 60 and accept that there might be a pullback. And 60 is also a sort of insurance, because you never know what will happen in the course of a campaign. It could be something positive could happen, but something negative can happen. And if it's negative, then you lose a few percentage points as well. So in my view, the priority for the independence movement is actually to build a strong, absolutely rock solid vote of 60% in favour of independence. And when you get to that, the fact is that Michael Gove and the present Secretary of State, Jack, are already on the record as pointing out that 60% they would regard as legitimate for a referendum. Because whatever criticism you may have of the British state, it is fundamentally a democratic organisation. And if you're at 60% and you sustain that over a long period of time, it becomes politically impossible to say no to a referendum. And at the moment, you would think the issue before the whole movement is the referendum. That's not a policy. The policy is to build the 60%.
Exactly.
What we're likely to get over the next 12 months is Nicola producing a bill which the presiding officer, being a Green, whatever our legal advice is, will not give a certificate against it. Tories will go to the Court of Session, and let's assume that the Court of Session says yes, which I doubt, but let's assume they say yes. It then goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, if you read all the cases, the constitutional cases at the Supreme Court, which I have done, then what comes clear? They root everything on the sovereignty of Parliament. Each time the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government have gone in on the Constitution, on devolution and the rights of devolution, they've been told irrelevant.
But the English Parliament doesn't exist anymore. The English Parliament disappeared in 1707, as did the Scottish Parliament. The Parliament of the United Kingdom, there is no law at all that says that that is sovereign. And the reason why that's important is because in Scotland, there's no concept at all of parliamentary sovereignty. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1380, which you'll all be familiar with, of course, says that sovereignty in Scotland rests with the people. That's still the case today in Scots constitutional law, still the case. And the Scottish courts have expressed an opinion in that regard, particularly in cases in the 50s to the 70s. What does that mean in practice? It means that if this clause becomes law, Scotland will have imposed on it a form of sovereignty that firstly doesn't exist in Scotland and secondly cuts across the Treaty of Union in 1707. And the Scottish courts have said that is something that they are willing to look at in terms of its justiciability. It doesn't affect us in Wales, I grant you, because our court system was abolished gradually between 1536 and 1830. But this actually is a fundamental attack on the 1707 Treaty of Union in Scotland. I'll leave it to the Scots to fight their own battle, but it's something that just hasn't been noticed. Parliamentary sovereignty has never been part of the law of the United Kingdom with regard to the Parliament of the United Kingdom, apart from now.
So we'll spend a year, and no doubt Ian Blackford will be able to get up in the House of Commons and engage in the grudge and grievance once again, where we're being dealt down by a Supreme Court where there's a majority of English and all the rest of it. And a year will have gone by. She'll have bought another year on this ridiculous India F2. And in the meantime, what are we doing about building towards 60% in favour of independence? Because times change. What we argued in 2014 will not do next time. And what we faced in 2014 is not what we are going to face next time. The British state has an even greater stake in Scottish independence this time than it did last time. Now, there's several reasons now. One is defence. Nothing has changed since 1707. Getting the Scottish border closed to any adversary was important in 1707. Keeping it within the United Kingdom is as important today as it was in 1707. And that base at Fastlane, very, very important. And then you've got the question of the seat on the Security Council. Now, in 2013 actually, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office sent a memorandum to the Foreign and Commonwealth Select Committee in the House of Commons saying Scottish independence as a threat, and therefore it's critical that we keep it. And they pointed out that if we lost Scotland, then there'd be immediate arguments that you're not entitled any longer to a place on the Security Council. Now there's a third thing that up until the 24th of February wasn't a big factor, and that's North Sea oil. Up until then, you never heard from them down in London about the importance of North Sea oil. In fact, there were 19 applications for engagement in the North Sea that were held on ice. Now, of course, the North Sea, very, very important. So we'll get the three things. We've got defence, the Security Council seat, and now North Sea oil. So the British state is going to have a lot at stake when we finally come to the referendum. And they are going to play very hard indeed. And we're not prepared for it. There are two things that go together to gain independence. One is to win the vote. But you're not independent the morning after you win the vote. No more than Britain was Brexit after the vote in 2016. We have to negotiate with England, essentially. And you've got to negotiate trade relationships. You've got to negotiate the division of assets and liabilities. And they will wish to negotiate about fast lane. If you look at the history, when Ireland started becoming independent with a free state, what did the British state insist upon? 2 naval bases in the west of Ireland. When Cyprus became independent, what did the British state insist upon for strategic reasons? The sovereign base in Ireland. Now, I don't think they'll try a sovereign base at Fast Lane, but certainly that will be a big factor in the negotiations. So not only do we need to win the vote on independence, simultaneously, we should be working on the negotiating brief. We're 5 million, they're 60 million. They're our biggest foreign market. We're in their sphere of influence, we're in America's sphere of influence, and we're in NATO's sphere of influence. We're just a small nation trying to negotiate our independence. There's a lot of thinking and a lot of examination of problems to come. I'll give you an example. To set up a separate currency, you need something like 47 billion foreign currency reserves to back it up. Our proportionate share of the UK foreign currency reserves is some round about 17 billion. It's estimated that you need 47 billion to back it up. So where do you get the extra? Now just imagine we're at the negotiating table and across from us is the British state. And the British state says, look, we know that you've got a gap in this. We can help you overcome it. 30-year lease on Fast Lane and we'll overcome the problem. We'll give you it. What do we say in those circumstances? And they add, by the way, there'll be no hard border. It'll be a free trade agreement. But if you don't agree, then it'll be WTO rules and a hard border. We've got to think like that. We've got to think, what are they going to ask for? What are they going to insist on? What is their break point that they cannot go beyond? What is our break point that we couldn't accept? That work has not been done. And until it's done, we would not be in a good position the morning after independence going into negotiations with the British state, which is very experienced in negotiating with people who are leaving it. There are moments when I'm in utter despair at folk marching up and down the country when they should be sitting thinking in groups and examining things.
Yeah, there's not been much policy development, if anything, since 2014, and a whole range of issues. You've highlighted a few there, but I mean, it really genuinely goes right across the board. And that's what worries me. I'm worried that by some miracle, Nicola ends up with a referendum next year, but we've got absolutely no answers to any of the problems, that are coming down the road. And, in my view, to be quite honest, I mean, I think Nicola's completely duplicitous about this. I think she wouldn't be upset if we lost it, you know. And if we could get some sort of little offer that gives her a few more trinkets to wave about and look important, then she'd probably settle for that. The vast majority of people like me and you that have been in the independence movement for decades is, you know, we want to see a result. We want to see this brought to a head, but we don't want it to be recklessly brought to a head or lazily brought to a head. And I think both those charges could apply at the moment. Nicola's directionalist, but the party in general is directionalist. The ordinary party member has lost control of the party. I remember when you and I were active in the SNP, it was undoubtedly the most democratic party, you know, I'd ever seen. The members controlled the party, and woe behind you if you were a senior office bearer and you promised to do something and didn't do it because you knew coming up at the next National Council there'd be branch constituency after that coming up and absolutely ripping you apart for not doing it. So everything worked because there was a discipline there that you knew the membership would hold you to account. Who holds the Scottish Government to account, or the SNP to account leadership? No one. The NEC's been completely replaced by appointed members rather than elected members. That the selection of candidates has been taken over centrally, and they remove MD who might remotely, issue any form of criticism. The whole thing's a complete, takeover that Stalin would have been proud of. The party has been rigidly controlled, and the results are there for all to see, I'm afraid. Yeah. So if you were in charge of the SNP, Jim, and you were wanting to get, imagine if we got to this 60% and you were wanting to go ahead, what are the key policy areas and what should be the process that's put in place so that we're well versed, the ordinary membership? I mean, I remember you and me, for instance, despairing during the 2014 referendum about the lack of preparation and work that had went into the pensions argument and how ill prepared. In fact, if I remember correctly, we used some funds from the Margot campaign to put adverts in to try and rescue what was a desperate, situation, which didn't need to be because, our case was good, but it just wasn't been put forward forcibly enough.
Well, I think you have to look at things in a reality. My criticism of the SNP also applies to the independence movement at the present time. They've put themselves in a green trap where Labour, for example, just as bad as anybody else, want to keep the oil and gas in the North Sea underground. Now, you're quite right, we need to look at what matters to people in the 50 to 80 group. That's some folk who are pensionable and others coming up with a pension. Bearing in mind that if you're 50 and you've got a mortgage and you've got a car, your car, your loan is in sterling, your car insurance is in sterling, your mortgages is in sterling, your house insurance is in sterling, and if you're in a works pension scheme, it's likely to be in sterling as well. So you have to produce an explanation for those people that they're quite safe because you're going to remain in the sterling area for some time to come before you have a separate currency. And I think the Alba Little Blue Book is very good on this, and it explains that you can have two bank accounts, one in which has got a Scottish currency and the other in which you pay into sterling so that your sterling liabilities are always paid. Now, that's kind of complicated, so therefore you've got to spend a lot of time explaining this to people to win them over to that factor. Then there's the economy. Now, people talk about the Scottish economy, and I think, again, the Little Alba book is quite correct. We are not a Scottish economy. We are a regional part of the UK economy. We're an adjunct to the southern economy. and where the major levers are all held by the Bank of England and the Treasury. So we inherit an economy which is not in a good position, which is not an independent economy. We need to build a new, very significantly different independent economy. That is going to require massive amounts of well-directed investment. Where do we get the capital for that investment? The North Sea and the Cairnfield. That's where you get it. That black stuff is capital wealth. Now, we're not in a position to nationalise the North Sea and the Cairnfield because we don't know enough about that industry to be able to do that, certainly when you have the Scottish civil servants try to run it. But what we can do, we can tell the oil companies either that we're taking 30% of their equity without cost, or we're going to have a wellhead tax, where effectively we will own, through that wellhead tax, the black stuff that comes, which we don't even own a cupful at the present time. Of course, that doesn't comply with the green mantra. So I think the independence movement has really got to reconsider its position on the green trap that they've put themselves into. Now, I am a skeptic about CO2 being the disaster that we are told by orthodox thinking. There's a large body of scientific opinion which does not agree with the orthodoxy. Now, I'll ask you something, Iain. I've asked other people, what is the capacity of the Earth's atmosphere? And what is the percentage of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere? Well, the Earth's atmosphere in metric tons is 5.5 trillion. Now, a trillion is 1 and 15 nothings. 5.5 trillion. The percentage of CO2 is 0.0407%. And I'm sure that all of those folk in the independence movement, most of them in the SNP, who go on about the climate emergency, don't know those figures. And we'll have to realise Ghana has discovered oil and is developing it. Guyana has discovered oil and can become as rich as Qatar if the distribution system's fine. In Africa, 2 years ago, the ministers of energy met in South Africa and declared, we've got millions without electricity, we're going to generate it, and what we've got to generate it with is coal. India, China, hundreds of coal-fired power stations. And if you look at the election manifesto of the BJP in India, they're going to build another 100 airports. They're going to build massive amounts of roads, quite properly, to open up their country and take people out of poverty. All of that is industrial activity. And we're being told that we have to be world leaders. We have to tell China and India and Africa, look at us, follow our lead. And they're going to tell you, we don't be so daft. And I think the independence movement better have another look at the green trap. Because without North Sea oil, without a share of the black stuff, forget about the taxation, you get that as well, but the black stuff is what matters. That's where the wealth lies. But without a share of that, we will not be able to reconstruct the Scottish economy. That's plain and simple. And that's something that we're dodging.
And of course, that's where also the access to large amounts of foreign currency are immediately delivered to you, because oil's sold in dollars, you know. So, I mean, there's that will be necessary for currency and a whole range of other issues, you know. So it's where we are. But I mean, I read your book, Jim, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I particularly found the section about, the green trap. I found that very, very interesting indeed, because I'm, like you, completely unaware of anyone in the SNP that's really studied this from both sides, So it's maybe something they'll need to do in the future if they're not to face disaster. The other thing I wanted to ask you, Jim, was, with all your experience, you've been around many, many, many years. Can you ever remember a situation where so many missed opportunities have, presented themselves and, far less, our actions failed, not even been attempted? And I mean, there's a whole range I could point to, but I'm sure you're as aware as I am. But I mean, most obviously, the Brexit thing, but all the rest of the issues are overwhelmingly missed opportunities.
I think it's very sad what's actually happened, that we have sunk into the hands of mediocrity, where there is absolutely no imagination and brought to bear upon the problems that our society faces. I mean, we're only 5 million people, and most of us are within an easy bus or train journey from wherever we live to the centre to our capital city. So that policies made at Holyrood should be easily understood by the policymakers as to whether they're working or not. And the transmission of reality to them from the general population is a very short distance indeed. We're almost an ideal size. Actually, we'd be better with 7 million of us because it would be a bigger economy. But in terms of communication, in terms of being able to have ideas flowing, we're an ideal size. And yet, we're in the hands of mediocrity. I mean, we can't build 2 ferries. Look, I've worked in the developing world. I don't think it would ever cross the minds of people in the Philippines, for example, that they couldn't build ferries. I mean, this is ridiculous. We have an education system that, when I was a boy, was a very good one, which was, in terms of the world at that time, which really only the Western world, because the rest of the world was colonialized, was one of the best. We now have one of the worst. And for some reason, we won't admit this is one of the worst. Therefore, we have to do something fundamental about it. And then you've got them, as I've already said. We have this enormous capital and technical resource in the North Sea. The Clearfield will be there for 40 years, and we're actually taking the position that we don't want it. I mean, I think I'm living in a parallel world at the present time. And I live in a world where there's reality, and then there's the world ruled by the mediocrities who happen to be the Scottish Parliament. I mean, it's one of the great tragedies.
Well, let's look at a political, conundrum. The SNP did pretty well in the local elections that have just passed. But the last few days have been filled with SNP councillors all complaining because all the unionist parties have got together and taken over control of all these councils. I mean, it's completely self-imposed pain. I mean, they blew off their own feet. I mean, the leaflet that said 2 votes SNP and no other party set that complete collapse. So just like the Holyrood election, you have a great first night, but when the list votes start to get reallocated, all of a sudden everything disappears. So I mean, to me, that's a lack of strategic ability, any ability at all, to plan how to advance the cause of independence, how it can possibly be better to hand councils control over to the unionist parties rather than have it pro-Indy. It doesn't make any sense, because one of the potential blocks, to a referendum could be local authorities refusing to let their facilities be used.
Well, they will. I mean, actually, who runs elections and referenda? It's local government.
Exactly.
No, the Scottish government doesn't run elections. They set the legislation, but they don't actually run elections. Get the papers out and get them counted. And if the legal advice to a major authority is that this is ultra virus, then the local authority says, I'm no playing.
Yeah. Exactly. As if someone maybe wanted to put obstacles in the way.
Look, Iain, a referendum will only be valid when it's done constitutionally with the agreement of the British state. That upsets lots of folk in the SNP, but that's a fact, because under the 1998 Act, which we voted for, by the way, the Constitution is a reserved matter for Westminster. So there'll be no referendum that carries the necessary legal credibility. If we ran a referendum in which local government would not take part, or parts would not take part, and
invalid,
in which the opposition would not take part, then you're in the Catalonian mess. You might, technically have just numerically won, but everybody knows politically it's a farce, and you're in a worse condition than you were before you started. That's the priority. I come back to it, is to build up the independence vote for it rock solid at 60%. And you have an unanswerable case then, because you're also talking internationally. I mean, what I would be doing now, I would be sending folk out to talk to folk, not just Nicola going to America. I would be sending people out to talk to the rest of the Western world in particular about how we are thorough constitutional nationalists to democracy, and explaining our position and winning friends and understanding, so that we could actually, if the British state started saying, oh, no, you start mobilizing international opinion, because they've got one significant weakness. They punt the importance of change by the ballot box all over the world. And if they're then faced with this, with foreigners saying to them, hey, wait a minute, you're not doing that in your own state, how can you possibly lecture us? So there's political things that you can do out with the country, which I don't think they seem to understand. We should have ambassadors going everywhere just to talk to folk.
I've suggested this before, Jim. We should be using our elected representatives, and each should be allocated a country to make contact with, not just with the party that's in power in the country, but with the opposition parties in that country as well. And we should build this complete network, because I know just from the time when I was the Honorary Consul for Estonia in Scotland, there is considerable support and sympathy amongst other countries, particularly European countries, to the situation that we're in. And we would be able to get access to have a lot of very important people if we only tried. Again, that's coming back to having a strategic brain at the centre of what the Scottish Government and the Scottish independence movement's doing. And we really need to get those in place. I mean, there is some competent people. I'm not saying they're all competent, because I agree totally with you at the beginning that some of what's been elected in recent times goes nowhere close to what has been elected in the past. But, I mean, we've got some competent people, and I think we would get results, because I think there's a welcome out there for us if we try. I mean, the danger here is, of course, that Ireland's going to overstrip us, and Ireland will be completely united long before we get out the starting blocks.
Well, you take the Westminster group, it's a very large group. What the hell are they all doing down there? Well, you obviously have to have a presence, because something can come up that affects us, and you have to have a presence. So you say, okay, 25 this month, 25 will man the House of Commons. The rest of you are out. You're out meeting individual countries because you're a member of Parliament, and you'll therefore be you'll be able to go through doors. A portion of you should come north and be campaigning day and daily for independence, holding public meetings, even if they're only small at the beginning, starting to build up and build. That's not happening. They're all Westminsterized down there. I mean, this is a huge human resource we have, and it's
getting used.
well resourced in terms of cash resources for research down there, and I can't see any real benefit from it whatsoever. I mean, where is the benefit to the independence movement? Getting up and shouting in the House of Commons at the English across the gangway, that doesn't advance us any in whatsoever. And also, by the way, we should be talking to people in England, because if you think ahead to the independence negotiations, it will be very important to have those negotiations on the basis of good relations. You don't want a negotiation in which the other side, which is 60 million, actually bitterly resenting what you've done. So we should be sending, those MPs should also be talking to civic organisations in England, explaining independence isn't because we don't like you. Independence is we don't like being politically controlled by the British state. And there's a difference. Whereas at the moment, south of the border, if you listen to Ian Blackford and the reaction to him, it's grudge and grievance, as though he's saying to the English, you're out to get us every day in the week. So we should really be thinking well ahead. You sit down to negotiations. Look what happened with Brexit. The Europeans were quite bitter about what happened. In fact, Macron said they'll be punished for this. We don't want that to happen between us and England. We want a good relationship. And a good relationship before independence will make the negotiations on independence much easier, because you'll be talking about, we understand your position and you understand ours better. But I can see no indication of that kind of thinking in the independence movement, never mind the SNP.
Well, thanks very much, Jim. It's been interesting chatting with you. I think a lot of people watching this will be thinking, well, there's some ideas in there that I wouldn't mind seeing happening. That's certainly my reaction to what you said. So once again, thanks for your time, Jim.
I'll leave you with one thought. Last time the independence movement faced better together. Next time, because of what Russia has done, we're liable to get better and safer together. And we better think about how to answer that now before we're faced with it.
As usual, Jim, good advice. Great seeing you. Keep well. I miss our chats, but hopefully we'll see more of it in the future. And to those viewers watching this program midweek, I hope you've enjoyed the content and enjoyed it as much as I have. I think I learned something in that conversation, and I suspect many of you will have done likewise. Thanks for viewing.
Bye.